Hello and welcome to today's podcast. So today's podcast, I'm on my own, okay? Rowan has other plans. I have been ditched by the other coach in the team. However, it's nearly Christmas, so I'm feeling very festive. So I'm going to let him off the hook a little bit. But we're going to get stuck into it again with a little bit of a presentation. So the last big kind of podcast we did was on sleep, and that went down really well. And I think you guys actually enjoyed learning about sleep. A lot of you watched it on YouTube, made notes, and found it really kind of useful and beneficial in the long run. And hopefully it will help you improve sleep with your clients moving forward, because obviously sleep is fundamental. So go and check that out if you haven't. But today's podcast is going to be about motivation, okay? And this should fit in nicely, because one of the questions I get asked a lot from like friends and from family and anyone else for that matter, clients, is that how are you so motivated all the time? And motivation is a tricky one, okay? Because you see a lot of people, like suddenly people start doing squats and they think they can be this like motivated person. Like realistically, all we're doing is lifting weights. All we're doing is controlling our calorie intake, and all we're doing is like optimizing our nutrition. It's not, people are doing bigger things, okay, that require more motivation. But nonetheless, for lots of people, motivation is something that they struggle with. And straight off the bat, like motivation, most people will not be motivated all the time. And I'd like to say that, like, I'm not motivated today, but I'm doing things. And that's the difference, okay? And today's podcast is going to be another presentation. So if you're listening, I'm sorry, but if you're watching, enjoy. I've done a little kind of mini literature review on the topic, and I'm going to talk about a few different domains of motivation, different theories about why as humans we are motivated or are not motivated for that matter, and then what we can actually do about it, okay? Because it's all well and good knowing all these theories, but if we can't actually do anything about them or do anything as a result of them, they're pretty much rendered pointless in my eyes, because it's just information for information's sake, and we don't suffer from a lack of information at the moment. If anything, there's too much information for us to process. So let's share my screen quickly and get started. So hopefully this works. Who says? Start again. Right then, here we go. So we're back on the mind map, I'm afraid. So again, if you're watching this, go head on over to YouTube, and it will probably help you a little bit more in how you can kind of visualize it. So I've tried to reduce it down because I was aware like the sleep one was very information heavy, which is good. Like there's a lot to cover, and like obviously I'm not the most well read in that field, but I have read somewhat in it. And the same with motivation. So we're going to try and frame the discussion around a definition first. And of course, with motivation, there's different discourses that link to motivation. It doesn't exist in just one area of academia. It is multidisciplinary, and therefore there will be different types of definitions based on which kind of field you're drawing from. So I've tried to draw from a vast body of research so that we can kind of get a well-rounded definition to move forward with, because obviously we can't really move forward if we don't define what motivation is. So if you're watching, again, it's color-coded so you can see it. So there's different types of definitions. So I've kind of looked at them and done some reading, and there's kind of inclusive definitions of motivation that try to bridge the gap between different discourses. There's mainly psychological driven definitions, and then there's emotional definitions. So there's obviously more as well. Like I just thought for the relevance of the podcast, it would be important to kind of reduce it to the main kind of areas and their definitions of it. So one definition at the top is that motivation is concerned with how people act, and therefore motivation concerns the energizing, direction, regulation, and persistence of behavior. And that's an important one. And I think that's why I put it first, because I think that as an inclusive definition, really does cover all of the bases in terms of what we're trying to facilitate as athletes, as coaches, as clients, so that we can persist in the behavior that we're trying to elicit or facilitate over a period of time. And in terms of an emotion-driven definition, some from that field view motivation as the process whereby an organism, so a human, selects out of a myriad of incoming messages those that are relevant to his or her personal needs. So that's an interesting one. So that will link heavily to some of the theories that I will talk about later on in the podcast, but there's a key emphasis on kind of relevance to individual needs, okay? And some of you are probably already thinking like this links to intrinsic motivation, stuff like that, self-efficacy. And you're right, but we're going to hold that thought for now and we're going to come back to it later. So that was an emotion-driven definition, and we're going to drop back to an inclusive definition again now. So for Morgan, King, and Robinson, it's quite an old definition, however, it doesn't make it any less relevant. They state that motivation has three aspects. So the first being a driving state within the organism that is set in motion by bodily needs, environmental stimuli, or mental events such as thoughts and memories. Two, the behavior aroused and directed by this state. And three, the goal towards which the behavior is directed. So that's interesting. So that's multidisciplinary, and does, again, as an inclusive definition, covers a lot of the fields that we're going to talk about, okay? And again, it's focusing on an action happening, something happening through and for something. So something to happen, there is a goal, there is a behavior that we want to facilitate and continue to facilitate as a result of our environmental, mental, and our bodily needs, okay? So again, that's drawing on a lot of literature and putting them together into one definition. And now towards a more psychologically based definition. Groves, and I can't say his second name, I'm afraid, I'm not going to butcher that. Their definition starts as, in common usage, drive and motive refer to ideas, needs, emotions, and organic states that compel our or incite individuals to action. Thus, according to most dictionary definition, drives and motives can be equated with the underlying cause of behavior. So again, what all of these definitions have in common is that it's almost like a feeling that then results in action, okay? We're not necessarily motivated and we don't create action. Something happens as a result of us feeling motivated, and there is a reason for us feeling the need to feel motivated or being motivated in itself. And that's where it's kind of gets a little bit trickier, okay? Because again, no one actually knows, because these are all concepts that are kind of made up. We just know they exist. People feel motivated, but why is that okay? So these are working definitions. And now we're going to look at some of the current theories around motivation. And hopefully you might be able to see where these are applicable to your life, you as an individual. And then we'll think about how we can actually improve motivation moving forward, because I know a lot of people, and the last podcast was on goal setting and how to make your goals optimal. This will flow nicely from that, okay? And this is where we kind of, the magic really happens, because if we can develop motivation or other things that might serve us better than motivation, as an athlete, you will be setting yourself up for a much more productive phase that you're in, because motivation drives action. And action is what we want as someone who's trying to change our state, change our body composition, change the way we look, we feel, and the way we perform. So again, disclaimer, these are all everyone else's ideas. They're not my ideas. I wish they were, but I'm not that intelligent. So what I've tried to do is summarize some of the key ideas into nuggets of information. And again, this is going to be quite an information heavy section of the video. And I'm going to be kind of reading the scholars' words and trying to potentially make some anecdotes and draw some similarities between experiences. So let's start off with one that probably most people have heard about. If you've done any level of like PE, you've probably heard of like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So we're going to start with that. So extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation are very well kind of researched, thought of, and referenced to within the literature. And extrinsic motivation is very often seen as kind of the bad guy or girl in terms of motivation. And the reason for that is that Extrinsic motivation relies on external factors to dictate the level of motivation that an individual has. And this can be kind of as fickle as like praise. I say fickle, but it can be as small as like positive reinforcement. It can be monetary, or any other perceived reward that the individual associates with the behavior or the action that they need to do. And the outcome or the behavior that they're trying to elicit is controlled by that external stimuli. So that reward or that punishment or that coercion or that situation that they find themselves in. So a good example of this would be like you work hard and show motivation towards your job because you want a pay rise. That doesn't necessarily inherently make it a bad source of motivation. It just can very often be seen as a very shallow form of motivation. And we'll see why later on in the podcast. But that's extrinsic. So now we're going to think about intrinsic, so the good guy or girl. And this is performing a task or eliciting the behavior that you want because of its perceived personal reward to the individual. And it often aligns, this is important, to the values and goals of that individual and its inherent satisfaction to that person. So, for example, giving a gift to someone or working hard to be able to buy something for someone you love, that's almost an intrinsic led motive. Okay, you want to do something nice for that person, and that probably aligns with your internal values or your goals. So your caring values, your traits of kind of looking out for people that you love and stuff like that. And I think, again, none of these are inherently good or bad, but they are just different areas that we need to call on when we're thinking about kind of physique development. Because in terms of physique development, intrinsic would be that you want to be a better version of yourself. You want to keep developing your physique, keep pushing yourself, keep striving to be more. An extrinsic motivator would be you want to win a bodybuilding show, or you want a little bit of social recognition for your hard work or all of the time that you've spent in the gym. And of course, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing, but it might not necessarily like lend you motivation all of the time. And coming from someone who's just competed, like I was both intrinsic and extrinsically motivated. Like extrinsically, because I was kind of worried about getting on stage and not being in shape. And intrinsically, because I wanted to push myself to levels that I've never done before. And they worked in kind of in line with each other to motivate me towards that goal that I had. And that doesn't mean this is the only theory, but this is just one theory. And I think it's one of the most applicable theories because we have those motivators coming from our social environment and from within that work in unison to elicit the behavior that we're trying to create or persevere with. So that's intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. I'm just going to close that and then move on to some other theories. So another big theory within the field of motivation is self-efficacy theory. And this is a big one, okay? And the main scholar on this one that I kind of drew influence from was Deci and Ryan. You can go and check them out if you want to. And they basically underpin motivation as a social theory, okay? And they kind of suggest that you can't necessarily separate motivation from what we experience around us. And there is never a lot of social theorists, not just these guys, see the social as kind of the main driver for most things because you cannot separate the individual from a social environment. So to them, motivation comes from social factors that then feeds into relatedness, competence, autonomy, and therefore we get motivation or different levels of motivation. And this is important because I think there's a lot of take-homes from this in how we can stay motivated within a process as an athlete, within our different phases of training or dieting. And if we think of each stage that they talk about, so the social factors of relatedness, the social factor of autonomy, and the social factor of competence, there is a lot of different kind of information that can be packed into each one of those subcategories. And in relation to relatedness, the thing that we want to be doing or the behavior that we want to create needs to be genuine. It needs to be respectful, and it needs to have a sense of involvement for the individual. And this is important, okay? So involvement links heavily back to the social dimension that these guys kind of draw from as their underpinning philosophy for this theory. And Involvement's a big one. And this is why you see kind of CrossFit doing so well, group classes doing so well. You see a sense of culture, involvement, respect, and warm interactions between those that are trying to achieve the same thing. And that sense of community can really motivate people within a social environment. Again, this is less focusing on the individual, but more pulling on the social dimension of motivation. Another one, and something that I think is key and is often very overlooked in kind of physique development, because a lot of coaches just tell clients what to do, and they tell them what to do. And as we can see from social theory, or self-efficacy theory, sorry, that autonomy for these guys is one of the biggest drivers in developing a motivated athlete, or motivation as a whole, because autonomy provides the athlete or the individual choice, and therefore feeds into them having a meaningful rationale and emotional kind of regulation towards the behavior they're trying to create. And autonomy is a fine line as a coach, because you don't necessarily want to give clients full autonomy, but you want to frame your decision making within an autonomous kind of relationship where they understand that your words are just advice. Like, I would never say to a client, like, you need to do this or else I'm going to sack you, or you're going to be in trouble. There's no sanction there. All of our clients have autonomy in what they're doing and their decision making. All we do is frame our conversations and frame the way we give the information to that client so that they can make the decision, that they can choose the behavior they want to kind of carry out with the most information that they can, that's possible to them. And hopefully that then makes an informed decision, as opposed to kind of a decision that's not necessarily going to move them towards their goals in that sense. And the last stage that these guys talk about within self-efficacy theory is that there needs to be a level of competence within motivation. And we'll talk about more about kind of challenges and competence later on, but there needs to be an optimal challenge. And the key word there is the optimal, okay? Challenges can push motivation one of two ways. Everyone's been in school where they've been given a test that's way too hard and they just are not motivated to do it. You probably just flunk it. You just like fill in the answers you don't know. That is not an optimal challenge. And the same goes for physique development. Like, there needs to be stepping stones, I call them, that kind of are manageable, they are reachable, and they are attainable and realistic, okay? Because shoot too far in the future, or shoot too advanced in a goal that's attainable, and you're setting that client up for failure, they will not get motivated. Or you pick a goal or a challenge that is too easy, they find it too easy, and then they lose motivation. So again, this is more from a kind of how you can develop it yourself. You need to be making sure that challenge is optimal, and that will come from time in the game, okay? You'll begin to know, and you'll be able to rationalize what is a optimal challenge. Where do you think you can be in a month, 2 months, 3 months in terms of your performance, and then set plans accordingly in place. And in terms of competence, again, they say that you should be involved in the task, and I think that links back to autonomy quite a lot. If you have choice, if you have a meaningful involvement in what you're doing, you will be involved in the task. And again, from a coaching standpoint, they say that competence heavily links to appropriate use of positive feedback. So if you're going it alone, you need to find an external source of feedback, positive mainly, because positive feedback will predominantly, if framed correctly, move you forward towards the goal that you're trying to achieve, and keep you motivated. And as we'll talk about in a second, if you get negative feedback, it will potentially reduce motivation and then subsequently remove you or distance you from attaining that goal. So that's social theory. And as you can see, like social theory, all of these theories cannot be kind of in isolation. They're all mutually exclusive. They benefit each other. And you need to pick and choose and see similarities in each of them and think, oh, wait, I definitely get motivated by these things. Right. So then, like, we'll talk about in the how to improve motivation section, what can we do then? Like, how can we actually improve it? And again, like I said, this section is very theory heavy, but I'm sorry, it needs to be discussed so that you can understand where kind of motivation is coming from. So next is a really interesting one. And again, coming from education, like this is something that was pushed in education quite a lot. And that's mastery versus ego. Okay. And there was a huge push in education for presenting children or students as masters of their learning. Okay. And it was framed within a kind of realm of chill students wanting to do something through their own accord and not being driven by their ego in how that in their motives for doing something. Okay. And it's an interesting one in terms of motivation, because if we're thinking about motivation as behavior, we still need to elicit the behavior. So if mastery leads to that behavior not happening, is it motivating? Potentially not, but that's only one potential flaw in this kind of theory. But Duda 2007, I want to say that's his or her name. It suggests that motivation is affected by the manner in which people construe their ability level and define success and failure. So, like I said, how you define success or failure. And two primary perspectives towards involvement in achievement situations play a major role in how individuals interpret and react to such settings, such as task and ego goal perspectives. So, in terms of motivation, task involvement equates to the human action of being motivated mainly by the task of mastery and by the experience of personal improvements. So that's task involvement, okay? And again, you can see the link here between the self-efficacy theory, the social theory, because they were suggesting that you should, as an individual, to be motivated, be involved in the process, have autonomy over your decisions. And we see this again here. Task involvement, the person, the individual is actively choosing to do the thing that they need to do to be motivated for. And that's interesting because that does present a lot of agency onto the individual, as opposed to just seeing them in passive in the process. Whereas alternatively, these guys suggest that the negative or the less effective way of approaching motivation is through ego involvement, okay? And this is where the kind of actions and the behaviors that we are trying to promote are motivated mainly by the wish to demonstrate superior competence. And you can see how this links heavily to kind of attainment and education, because if we're just driven by being better at something and being the best at, I don't know, maths, English, the likelihood of that happening for most people isn't realistic. So therefore, if that is the sole driver for their motivation, it will very soon run out. And that's the same for physique development. Like if you're new to training, an ego, it's hard to separate ego because everyone has an ego, but if ego involvement is your sole motivator, like you want to be Mr. Olympia, say, in your first year of training, like that is a very ego driven goal that is presenting you as superior to all other bodybuilders in the world and is very unrealistic. But instead, what you should or could try and facilitate is that task involvement will serve you much better. And we see this a lot in natural bodybuilding. Like a lot of the time, the people with the best physiques love the process. And the process here is task involvement. They enjoy the mastery of what they're doing. And in terms of physique development, mastery is your nutrition, your recovery, your training, and optimizing all of those things instead of just trying to chase what you see in the mirror. Because very often, if you master those things, what you see in the mirror will be a lot better anyway, because the things that you master are the things that dictate and improve and change what you see in the mirror. So that's where, like in the goal setting podcast, we spoke about process and outcome orientated goals. And this is heavily tying into process orientated goals as mastery and seeking to master any of the skills that obviously lead to the outcome or the behaviors that we want. So in mastery, success and failure is defined in terms of self-reference perception of the person's performance. And in the ego involvement or the ego-driven motivation, success is experienced when a person performs better than their peers or similarly with less effort. And that's important because, again, that's how you perceive failure. And if we perceive failure differently, and from a different kind of area of the theory, we will subsequently get different kind of impacts on motivation. If we see failure as that guy beat us, and that's it, motivation will soon drop off. But if we see it as I kind of did better than I've ever done before, but it still wasn't good enough, maybe that will serve us better in terms of motivation. And again, we'll use this theory to kind of provide some actionable feedback and actionable points that we can use to improve motivation going forward. So again, let's move on to some kind of different forms of extrinsic motivation. So like I said, extrinsic and intrinsic is heavily researched, okay? And like I said, extrinsic often gets a bad name. And there is good reason for it to get a bad name, but there's also, like I said, they both work together. You can't separate one from the other. So extrinsic has been heavily researched, and subsequently there's been different kind of theories or different notions that have been put forward to explain extrinsic motivation. So Ryan and Deci 2000, they kind of thought around the notion of introjected regulation, and this is motivation heavily based on control, okay? In which the individual behavior is regulated by internal sanctions and pressures directed to attaining reward that are very ego-driven, or they are driven or motivated by sanctions such as guilt and shame. And this is an interesting one because, again, this is how the individual or the athlete perceives success and failure. But this is where we see kind of internal dialogue and internal behavior regulated by sanctions and pressures from the external world and from the ego acting in unison. And then there's sanctions based on psychology, which we see a lot in athletes, okay? Like a lot of physique athletes do feel shame or guilt if they have a bad relationship with food and they go out for a meal post-show, or they're on a prep, or they're on a photo shoot prep and they slightly go over the calories. And this is introjected regulation because they are regulating and motivating themselves to either do or to not do something. And for example, that fear of shame might motivate them not to have that bite of food, for example. Whereas if they didn't have that kind of internal dialogue or that internal processing, they might go over their calories. And again, this is where we see them all working together, and we don't see any of these kind of theories in isolation. And another one is identified regulation. And this is where behavior is relatively autonomous and the task identifies with the value of the individual. And this is important. So this is a good one. And again, this links heavily to physique development because the narrative here is that I want to and I choose to, as opposed to I have to. Okay. So the introjected regulation is almost on a sense of fear, of self-judgment, of self-criticality, as opposed to the identified regulation is where we are, I choose who I want to. And this can be very empowering in changing a narrative of an athlete. And I think we should always be trying to think, I choose who I want to. It should never be, I have to. And of course, there will be times where you'll need to flip between the two. There will be times when you have to do things that you don't want to do. Like go to work. Like, do you know what I mean? Like go to food shopping, like go to going to sleep. But those things don't necessarily always involve motivation because you have to do them. But for things like physique development, I want to, I choose to, and changing the narrative around that is really interesting. And the minute you transition away from kind of being a relatively new gym goer to someone who actually just loves training and going to the gym, and you want to go to the gym, and if you don't go to the gym or train or nail your nutrition, you don't necessarily feel like it's you that's carried out that day, that's a great place to be in. So that identified regulation is a really good, powerful form of motivation that we can use to drive us through both dieting phases and gaining phases. And like we said, none of these theories are inherently bad. They are all kind of taken with a pinch of salt. Take influence from all of them and see all of them in your own actions. And that's an important way of looking at it. And if you're extrinsically motivated, it's not a bad thing. Like, that's fine. Like, I'm sure at some point, like Steve Jobs was extrinsically motivated. Like he wanted loads of money, probably. So, like, do you know what I mean? Like, lots of millionaires are not saying that they're the best athletes, but they are driven by extrinsic factors such as money. And if money is a source of happiness for you, then that's absolutely fine, and that can be a motivator that you can draw on. But what I would recommend is that you don't necessarily just rely on one form of motivation. You use these interchangeably. You have a little bit of kind of internal narrative development and so on and so forth, so that you can improve these things. And then potentially what you'll find is that on one day where those extrinsic motivators aren't kind of there anymore, you can rely on your intrinsic ones, or you can feed off of your desire to master the craft of training, of nutrition, instead of just relying on, right, I want to look good all the time. Do you know what I mean? Because there'll be periods where you won't look good. Like, that's life, okay? Especially as a natural athlete, you probably need to be getting a little bit chubbier. And if you solely rely on that extrinsic validation of, right, someone saying you look good, you'll very soon become unmotivated, okay? So, like I said, factors impacting kind of motivation: multidisciplinary, psychological, social, and physiological. And again, we won't go too much into them because I do think the theories here have covered them nicely. There was a broad kind of array of theories I pulled from different areas of literature. And now the important question, like, how do we actually improve motivation? Okay. And this is a big one, and this is important. Okay. And again, this feeds heavily off of the previous podcast on goal setting. We need to think about what truly drives us as an athlete. Okay. So what are your internal values? What are your goals from those values? And if we know our internal values, we can use those to feed and spearhead our motivation moving forward. And what I'd recommend is that you do kind of go on a value kind of questioning process. And I do this with my clients. Like, if you're listening to this is kind of the weird period where we're setting up for January. And I've been asking a lot of my clients, like, what values do you align with? What's your goal identity that you want from the process? And we spoke about goal identity in the last podcast, so I won't spend too long on it. But from that goal identity, you should find values that align at your core, okay? And these aren't like, oh, I want to look good on the beach. Like, these are not those. These are the kind of empathy, discipline, traits like that we can pull on and use to draw motivation from, and then subsequently use those to impact our behavior. So by aligning those internal values and goals with your nutrition and exercise routine, it will seem to create that environment that really does facilitate your success and almost kind of removes that need for motivation at all. And that's something that I was going to talk about later on, is that motivation should stem from self-actualized discipline in some sense, okay? Because like we said, like, you're not going to be motivated all the time. So if you're relying on kind of external regulation of this motivation, you're very soon going to run out of it, because some days you have a poor night's sleep, like, you're not motivated. But if you have that almost internal pressure on yourself to go to the gym, and of course, like, this is a slippery slope. You don't want to be kind of beating yourself up all the time, but there needs to be some form of accountability that you hold for yourself, okay? And most people don't like to hear that. We live very much in kind of a period at the moment where we are kind of legitimizing excuses. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like, everyone needs downtime, but at some point you do need to, like, pull your socks up and do the things that you don't want to do. Because if you don't do those things, if that behavior doesn't align with your goals, like, you need to question whether that goal is actually enough to motivate you, because chances are it isn't, okay? So for example, pulling back to someone who wants to get on stage, they want to show themselves that they can do this, okay? So that's more than enough to get them up to do their morning cardio, to do 15,000 steps a day, to eat less food than they've ever eaten before. And that's important, okay? And they need that regulation internally to say, like, right, I'm not gonna take my foot off the gas now, when every sinew in their body is telling them that they don't want to do this next step or do this next rep, or they just want to eat a burger. What's stopping them from doing it? It's that internal dialogue, and it's the internal narrative. And of course, like, this can be negative. Like, this isn't always good. Like, trust me from experience, like, this internal narrative can be at a detriment to your mental health. But we need some form of internal regulation where we can regulate our behaviors based on an internal pressure from an internal relationship between our behaviors and our actual goal. Okay, what do you actually want to achieve? Again, moving on from that, I was quite passionate about that, so sorry. Again, pulling on from that social theory, we want to build your motivation around autonomy. Okay, so you should have choice in what you're trying to achieve. You should have understanding of what you're trying to do. And you should have appreciation of your individual needs within this process again. And the problem with motivation, it does get very kind of masculine, like work hard all the time, blah, 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 blah. And I kind of flipped into that a minute ago when I was talking about you can't make excuses for yourself. Yes, true, but there also needs to be some form of recognition and appreciation of the individual needs, the realistic nature of the kind of motivation and the goals that feed that motivation. And again, like autonomy does not mean letting yourself not do things if you've set them as like non-negotiables or set them as something you want to achieve. And again, this is where you can put on kind of extrinsic motivation. Get yourself a coach who's going to motivate you. Get yourself a coach who's going to hold you accountable. And like I said, like extrinsic motivation isn't bad. Use it wisely. And likewise, use the internal regulation wisely. If you don't necessarily have that internal regulation, that's fine. Outsource it. Get a coach. Get a family member to hold you accountable. And again, this is where we're picking different ideas from different theories and using them to improve our motivation. And again, we're seeing here that motivation is multifaceted and needs to be seen as such and cultivated as such. It's not just going to happen on its own in isolation. So again, to build motivation, we need to find a goal that's challenging, okay, and involves mastery. So I've kind of combined two theories there. So we want a goal that's realistic and challenging, but involves mastery of the process. Do not pick a goal that you perceive as having control over, and unless you like that, okay. And mastery is an interesting one because no one will be a master at the start, okay? There needs to be some perseverance. So use the motivation you have as at the start of a process wisely to fall in love with what you're doing, okay? And this is where it's important, for example, especially with our clients, like for any new client, we're gathering feedback all the time on how they're feeling, how they're performing, and trying to make the mastery process as effortless as possible, okay? Even so much so that they don't really think that they're mastering anything. They're just kind of enjoying the process. They're going along with it and they're getting a result at the end of the day, but they're also enjoying and falling in love with what they're doing. Because if you can get a client who's potentially liked the gym before to start enjoying the gym, they're beginning to become a master of what they didn't like before. And therefore motivation will stem from that. And within that, you're also setting kind of attainable and challenging goals, which again, is completely person dependent, but make sure, following on from the goals podcast, that you are setting goals and they are challenging to you. Just a drink of my coffee. So again, I did definitely shoot forward to the point, but we do need to see motivation as stemming from kind of self-discipline. And you'll see it a lot on Instagram, kind of discipline over motivation, stuff like that. It's all well and good saying that, but if you can't get your clients, or for that matter, an Instagram post isn't going to make you disciplined. Sorry, I said it. But like, do you know what I mean? Like, what can you actually do about that? You need to have some form of motivation to start, and then discipline will be facilitated later on down the line. Importantly, we need to align the process of needing motivation with your goal identity. And I'm not going to spend too long speaking about this because we spoke about this last time. So go through a process of finding what the goal identity you want to create from the process that you're in. And then think about how you can motivate yourself towards that. But realistically, if you become very clear on your values, your goals that actually underpin your being, you will be motivated by them daily. And that's where, like I said in the first point, you need to align that with your fitness and physique development goals. For example, if you are like a very social and caring person, going to a bodybuilding gym where everyone's got their hoods up, not necessarily like talking to anyone like gyms that I go to. it's probably not going to set you up and keep you motivated for very long, because it doesn't align with your internal values of being a social person. Instead, it'd be better to go to kind of potentially a CrossFit gym. Yeah, I said it. Where there tends to be, I'm sure there's outliers in this, there tends to be a sense of community and responsibility and care within the members, as opposed to potentially a bodybuilding gym where it might be a little bit more independent or isolated, or maybe in a pure gym where it's really, really kind of everyone's just there because they're there. They're not really talking to anyone. So align those processes with your goal identity and it'll make it a lot easier. Of course, you can't talk about kind of motivation without talking about habit formation. And James Clear, again, he's got mentioned in both podcasts. His blog's incredible. So go and check that. You can literally type in James Clear. He has tons. He's literally written like 20 books and put them online, pretty much. And again, habit creation will create discipline, which will precede motivation, but they'll work in unison again. Nothing's in isolation. Again, motivate yourself through goal setting and reviewing. Okay, a goal without a review process is pointless. But again, we spoke about this in the goal setting podcast, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. Go and listen to that if you would like to. And the important one here is understanding that motivation will be finite. And I know I opened up the podcast with this. And if we rely on motivation too much, we'll very soon drop off, because we don't always want to do things. Motivation goes ups and down. Literally, like if the wind changes direction, I'll be not motivated, but I will know that I will do the things that I need to do. And a reliance on discipline and value guided behavior change to enable action when motivation is low is the best approach, in my opinion. So again, it's how do we build that motivation? Well, habit formation, self-discipline, external motivators, potentially a bit of punishment, but it doesn't like to get talked about like that, okay? Because obviously punishment is bad, but if there is sanctions, if, for example, one of the biggest ones for a lot of my clients is like, if they don't do a session, I'll ask them why, or if they don't do a cardio session, I'll just bring it up and we speak in a consultation. And it's not me punishing them, but even the presence of like talking about it can be enough, or the thought of having me kind of speaking about it on a consultation is enough for people to kind of do that. And then we're building momentum, we're creating discipline. And then very soon, I don't need to say, you'll find the instances where they're not doing, there'll be more instances where they are doing the things that they don't want to do, and less instances where they aren't. And that's the magic place, okay? That's where discipline's overtaken and motivation. And the last few are very important nonetheless, and that's to kind of sometimes just embrace the suck, okay? Like embrace the grind. And I don't like the word grind at all. Like I think it's very macho and masculine, and I think a bit pointless. Like embrace the grind, man. Like all we're doing is going to the gym, like, and eating in a calorie deficit. So it's not really the grind. I'm sure people, a lot of different bit, like working 4 jobs and having 2 children is probably the grind. So getting on a treadmill and doing 30 minutes of cardio isn't the grind, but nonetheless, it does feel like crap sometimes. So embrace it and learn to like sit there for a bit. And this is something I realized in prep, like you've got these things you need to do that feed into what you want to achieve. So do them and just embrace them and get on with them, because once you've done them, you'll feel great. And you really will be surprised on what you can do when you don't want to do something, okay? And anyone who's gone through like an extreme diet or done extreme things will know that you're capable of way more than you think. And going to the gym isn't really asking much of humanity, is it? Like it's a basic need. Yes, physique development's a little bit more on one end of the spectrum in terms of like extremes, but we're meant to be healthy. We're meant to have some form of muscle mass. We're meant to be able to do basic movements. So facilitating that for going to the gym shouldn't necessarily be like the grind or suck, but for some people it will be at the start. But then it will kind of very quickly transition away from that and then tie into your goal identity that you want to achieve. And one of the biggest ones for motivation and important in all walks of life is to kind of reduce friction points. And you need to be thinking about why, if you find yourself getting demotivated or lacking in motivation frequently, you need to reverse engineer it and think why. And there'll very often be friction points. It could be a negative comment. It could be a poor training session. It could be poor sleep. And what you'll find from reverse engineering things is that you will find the reason for low motivation and you can reduce them overall. You can reduce that friction point. And by reducing friction point, you can reduce its impact on your motivation. But of course, remember, motivation is not finite in itself, but if we can reduce the kind of friction and almost the buffering effect of life on our motivation, we'll naturally have more to be able to use to develop towards our goals. So I have absolutely flown through that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to seeing my face. So that was quite an intense and busy podcast. Okay, so if you have any questions, if you're watching on YouTube, just let me know in the comments. If you are on Spotify, Apple Podcast, don't forget to kind of follow us, subscribe, give us a review if you're new. And of course, if you've got this far in the podcast, or wherever you're watching, of course, we are an online coaching service. We work with people to get their best physiques, and we're driven by efficiency. So we do the efficient things really well. We don't do anything that doesn't work. We're driven by a passion for this. As you can tell from me speaking on my own in a spare room, I love this stuff, okay? And I can talk about this forever. And that flows into my clients, okay? And then lastly, we are driven by client success. We just want our clients to get to the results that they want and support them and give them autonomy in that process along the way. So thank you for listening. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a good day. But other than that, I will leave you there and I will see you in the next podcast.